Before the sun rose over the Atlantic on a cold April morning in 1775, a single lantern swayed in the tower of the Old North Church, and then another, and in that quiet, trembling light began a chain of events whose consequences would echo for centuries. The man watching the lanterns was not famous. History would not carve his face into marble or print his name in school books. His name was Elias Ward, a cooper by trade, a dockside worker by necessity, and a thinker by accident. He stood hidden among the barrels and ropes near the Charles River, feeling the damp air soak through his coat, unaware that his life and the lives of millions yet unborn had just taken a sharp turn. Elias had been born in Boston in 1749, a child of empire. The Union Jack flew above his cradle, British coins paid for his bread, and British laws defined his limits. Like most men of his class, he learned early that history was something done by kings and generals, not by men whose hands smelled of tar and oak. Yet Boston was a city where ideas moved as fast as ships, and Elias grew up listening more than speaking, absorbing arguments shouted in taverns, whispers traded on wharves, sermons that blurred the line between faith and rebellion. By the time he reached his 20s, the city was restless. Taxes came down like orders from a distant god who never answered prayers. The Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, the Tea Act, each one landed harder than the last. Elias did not care for politics in the abstract, but he cared deeply about fairness. He had watched his father work himself into an early grave to pay debts that never seemed to shrink. He had seen British soldiers shove colonial boys aside as if they were furniture, and he had felt, without fully understanding it, that something essential was being denied. On the night the lanterns were lit, Elias was not thinking about revolution. He was thinking about a shipment of barrels due at dawn and the penalty he would face if they were late. But when he saw the signal, 2 lanterns, meaning the British were coming by sea, he understood instantly what was happening. The city's underground network, built on trust and rumor, was in motion. Paul Revere would ride, William Dawes would ride, and dozens of nameless men would do their part. Elias ran. He ran through narrow streets slick with fog, past houses dark and silent, toward a small stable where a borrowed horse waited. His role was simple: warn a cluster of militia families on the outskirts of town. He had done it before in drills and false alarms. Tonight felt different. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. As he rode, Elias thought of nothing but the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the words he would shout at each door. Yet beneath that urgency lay a deeper realization. There would be no turning back. If blood was spilled, history would split into a before and an after. By dawn, shots had been fired at Lexington. By noon, the road back to Boston was lined with smoke and rage. Farmers who had never traveled more than 10 miles from home stood shoulder to shoulder, firing from behind trees and stone walls. British soldiers, trained for open battle, fell to an enemy they could barely see. Elias watched from a distance, his stomach knotted, his mind struggling to reconcile the chaos before him with the quiet life he had known. The war that followed did not unfold like the stories later told. It was not a clean march from oppression to freedom. It was confusion layered upon fear, courage mixed with selfishness, and ideals constantly tested by reality. Elias joined the Continental Army not out of burning patriotism, but because the war had come to him. He marched through mud and snow, endured hunger and disease, and learned that liberty was an idea powerful enough to keep men standing when their bodies wanted to collapse. At Valley Forge, winter carved itself into memory. Men died not from bullets, but from cold and neglect. Elias shared a tent with 3 others, including a former slave named Jonah Freeman, who had run north after hearing whispers that the British might offer freedom in exchange for service. Jonah spoke little of his past, but when he did, Elias felt the weight of a contradiction that haunted the revolution. How could men fight for liberty while denying it to others? The question followed Elias long after the snow melted. When the war finally ended and independence was declared not just on paper but in practice, Elias returned to Boston, older than his years. The city celebrated, but beneath the joy lay uncertainty. A nation had been born, but it was fragile, untested, and deeply divided. Elias married, started a small business, and tried to live quietly, yet history refused to loosen its grip. In the 1780s and 1790s, the United States struggled to define itself. Arguments over federal power, states' rights, debt, and expansion filled newspapers and dinner tables. Elias listened again, as he had in his youth, absorbing the voices of a new era. He voted when he could, paid his taxes reluctantly, and watched as leaders he had once admired quarreled like rivals in a family inheritance dispute. Then came the turn of the century, and with it a sense of destiny. The nation looked westward, convinced that land and opportunity stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. Elias, now a father, watched young men leave Boston for territories he could barely imagine. Among them was his eldest son, Samuel, who believed that America's future lay not in ports and ships, but in fields and rivers yet unnamed. Samuel's letters arrived sporadically, describing a land both beautiful and brutal. He wrote of encounters with Native American tribes, some peaceful, others wary, all displaced by the relentless push of settlers. He wrote of towns rising overnight and vanishing just as quickly. And he wrote with a tone that troubled Elias of a belief shared by many that God himself had granted Americans the right to take what lay before them. Elias sensed history repeating itself in a new form. Once the colonies had chafed under an empire that claimed divine sanction. Now his own nation spoke in similar language. He wondered whether liberty, once won, could be lost not through defeat, but through arrogance. When Elias died in 1812, the year the young nation went to war again with Britain, he was buried quietly, his name recorded in a church ledger that would yellow and fade. He left behind no grand speeches, no monuments, yet his story did not end with him. Samuel survived the frontier and moved further west, carrying with him his father's questions. He witnessed the forced removal of native tribes, the expansion of slavery into new territories, and the growing divide between North and South. He prospered materially, yet struggled morally, torn between opportunity and conscience. By the time the Civil War erupted in 1861, Elias Ward's grandchildren stood on opposite sides of the conflict. One wore blue, believing the Union was the last safeguard of the ideals born in 1776. Another wore gray, convinced that his way of life and his understanding of freedom was under attack. The family letters from that period, preserved by chance in a trunk, reveal not hatred but sorrow. Each side claimed the legacy of the revolution, even as they aimed rifles at one another. The war shattered illusions. Hundreds of thousands died. Slavery ended, but equality remained elusive. The nation survived, altered and scarred. Elias's descendants scattered, some returning east, others pushing further west, carrying fragments of his unspoken legacy. In the early 20th century, one of those descendants, Margaret Ward, became a school teacher in Ohio. She taught American history to children whose parents had come from Europe, drawn by the promise of freedom and work. Margaret told the story of the Revolution with care, emphasizing not just victories, but contradictions. She spoke of courage and hypocrisy in the same breath, insisting that loving one's country required honesty. Her students lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and the dawn of the Cold War. They watched America rise as a global power, convinced that their nation now stood as a defender of liberty worldwide. Yet echoes of the past persisted in racial segregation, in fear of dissent, in debates over how much freedom could be sacrificed for security. One student, James Carter, remembered Margaret's lessons when he landed on the beaches of Normandy in 1944. As bullets tore through sand and men fell screaming, he thought not of glory, but of responsibility. He believed, as millions did, that history had placed America in a role it could not refuse. After the war, prosperity reshaped the nation. Highways cut through cities, suburbs bloomed, and television carried shared narratives into every living room. The story of America became cleaner, simpler, more heroic. Yet beneath the surface, unresolved questions simmered. The civil rights movement forced the country to confront promises long deferred. Marches, speeches, and violence filled the streets and screens. Once again, Americans argued over the meaning of freedom, equality, and justice. Once again, ordinary people found themselves pulled into history. In 1963, during the March on Washington, a young man named Thomas Ward, Elias's distant descendant, stood among the crowd. He listened to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak of dreams rooted in founding ideals. Thomas felt a strange continuity, as if voices from centuries past were whispering through the words echoing across the National Mall. The decades that followed brought progress and backlash, hope and disappointment. America sent men to the moon while fighting controversial wars abroad. Technology shrank distances, accelerated change, and amplified division. Each generation believed it faced unprecedented challenges, even as it echoed the struggles of those before. At the dawn of the 21st century, the nation stood again at a crossroads. Terrorist attacks shook its sense of invulnerability. Wars were launched in the name of security and freedom. Surveillance expanded. Debates over liberty returned with renewed urgency. The lanterns of warning, though now digital and constant, still flickered in the background of public life. In 2020, amid a global pandemic and widespread protests, Americans once more questioned who they were and who they wished to be. Statues were toppled, histories re-examined, and long-silenced voices demanded recognition. The past refused to stay buried. If one traces a line from those lanterns in 1775 to the present day, it becomes clear that American history is not a straight path, but a series of circles, each generation returning to familiar questions under new conditions. What is freedom? Who deserves it? How much can be compromised before it is lost? Elias Ward could not have imagined smartphones, skyscrapers, or satellites orbiting Earth, yet he would recognize the arguments, the anxieties, and the hope. He would recognize the tension between ideals and reality, and he might understand, better than most, that history is not made only by presidents and generals, but by countless ordinary people responding, often imperfectly, to moments they did not choose. The astonishing truth of American history is not that it began with revolution, but that it never stopped revolving. Each generation inherits unfinished business from the last. Each generation lights its own lanterns, warning of dangers seen and unseen. And somewhere, in archives and memories, the lives of men like Elias Ward endure, not as legends, but as reminders that the past is never truly past. It is a living presence, shaping choices, demanding reflection, and challenging a nation to live up to the promise that first flickered in the darkness of an April night.